Today, I am delighted to introduce Andrew Leong, Assistant Professor of the Department of English and a member of the CJS Executive Committee. Andrew's research focuses on the literature of Japanese diasporas in the Americas, as well as queer and critical theoretical approaches to the study of literary genre, gendered embodiment, and generational time. He approaches the study of Asian American literature and literatures of Asia and the Americas with special attention to the generative frictions within and among multiple languages and literary traditions. The title of his presentation today is The Spiritual Foundation for Settler Life, Generational Consciousness and Japanese American Literature, 1917 to 1925. Please welcome Andrew.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Junko. My talk today is entitled The Spiritual Foundation for Settler Life, Generational Consciousness in Japanese American Literature, 1917 to 1925. And I want to focus on the forum here of a Center for Japanese Studies talk and really think through what I appreciate about Japanese studies in particular, that it's a multidisciplinary arena for scholars in literature, as well as scholars in other social sciences and humanities to meet and exchange knowledge more broadly. And I am very appreciative of that space. For those reasons, I wanted to turn to a problem of generation that crosses discussions in many disciplines. So one thing to note in particular is that a generational frame in studies of Japanese American diaspora, as well as Japanophone diasporas elsewhere, often adopt the terminology of Issei or Nisei, or first or second generation. And there are many, many monographs by scholars in a wide range of disciplines that employ Issei, Nisei, even Sansei in titles. I know that some of the participants and even the audience here have likely written or articles or books along these lines. The problem of generations as a disciplinary issue can be broken down into maybe two divisions, one positivist and the other romantic historicist. So positivist methods of dealing with the question of generation tend to look at it in quantitative and materialist terms. These approaches might lean towards more natural scientific or empirical scientific discourses in the German category of Naturwissenschaft. On the other hand, there are more romantic historicist, qualitative and idealist understandings of generation, which might align themselves more with studies of the mind, the spirit, or the German category of Geisteswissenschaft, social sciences and the humanities. Until recently, it was somewhat difficult to understand when, in the context of Japanese American written discourse, the generational terms Issei and Nisei appeared. However, quantitative searches of the Hoji Shimbun digital database hosted at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University have made it more possible to do kind of large corpus searches for when Issei and Nisei appear to be circulated as terms for generational populations as we now understand them in the United States. I've written more about this in the occasional paper, Roots of the Issei, which is available through Hoover Press. So if you're curious for questions of methodology and other considerations, please do check that out. I think it's a 99-cent ebook on Hoover Institution Press's webpage. To summarize the research findings here, Issei runs into a lot of OCR misrecognition problems. So lines that are followed by sekai, for instance, register as Issei when they're not really Issei in this generational sense. So it requires a combination of both brute force searches for all instances of Issei in the database, and then hand checking through to make sure which ones are indeed instances of Issei as a generational concept or not. But to summarize these findings briefly, Finding one is that uses of Issei and Nisei to refer to Japanese immigrant generations did not appear in newspapers until the late 19-teens. When they did, these instances were confined to publications authored by educated elites. And third, that newspaper-sponsored literary contests in the mid-1920s, shortly after the Johnson-Reed Act, vastly reduced Japanese immigration to the United States. It was only really those literary contests that played a key role in encouraging the wider use of the terms Issei and Nisei outside of the narrow population of educated elites and leaders in the immigrant community. So I want to take as an example of educated elite discourse one of the earliest instances that I could find of explicit use of Dai Issei and Dai Nisei discourse. And for the purposes of UC Berkeley Center for Japanese Studies talk, it seemed appropriate to look at an alum, Kanzaki Kiichi, who did graduate work in history at UC Berkeley. This is his article, Zaibei Doho no Zento, or The Road Ahead for Compatriots in America, which appeared in the Nichibei Shimbun, a Japanese language newspaper based in San Francisco, in the New Year's edition of 1917. Kanzaki Kiichi's subheadline, the question, what will the fate of the Zaibei Doho, or compatriots in America, be in 20 years? For the sake of the Dai Nisei, I urge the Dai Issei to pay attention. This article also is what gives my talk its title. These lines here, there's simply no comparing the spiritual conditions of our compatriots in America with those of a decade or so before. Our training in the spiritual foundation, essential for participating in the settler way of life, has gradually become more certain or more secure. So I really want to try to figure out what's going on with this discourse of spiritual foundation, or seishin teki kiso. And to do this, I'm going to do a three-part institutional analysis of the bureaucratic affiliation of Kanzaki Kiichi as Secretary General of the Japanese Association of America, a kind of extension of consul generals who were tasked with collecting statistical and population data of Japanese in the United States, the educational background that Kanzaki Kiichi had at the University of California, and the media context of the Nichibei Shimbun, and how that set the terms for later distribution of literary contests through newspapers to disseminate generational consciousness and generational terminology, or the spirit of generation as an idea for organizing Japanese American community. So the first domain is the bureaucratic one. And here, Kanzaki Kiichi is known for authoring and being in charge of these English language publications, California and the Japanese, and statistics relative to the Japanese immigration and the Japanese in California in 1921 and 1920. And the need for this type of statistical compilation really attaches to the broader use of increasing consultation of social scientists, mainly economists and people working in history that would then border onto political economy, through examples like this, the Dictionary of Races or Peoples, which was submitted as a statistical report to the Dillingham Commission on Immigration in 1911. Dillingham Commission, pictured here, featured the work of prominent social scientists, economists like Jeremiah Jenks, I believe affiliated with Cornell, who employed then developing techniques of economics and social science in order to furnish the material for the bureaucratic racism, the Dictionary of Races or Peoples, filtered through the scientific racism of the emerging social sciences during this period. So this serves as a transition or signal for why thinking about bureaucratic racism means that it's also important to think about the institutional context where Kanzaki Kiichi might have received his own training in social scientific methods. Here we can turn to Kanzaki Kiichi's own educational background or trajectory. So Kanzaki Kiichi was born in Okayama in 1884. And in 1901, at the age of 17, graduated from the academic department of Kansei Gakuin, henceforth Kangaku, a private non-denominational Christian college in 1901. After enrolling in Kangaku's English course, Kanzaki would eventually travel to the United States as a foreign student, matriculating in the College of Commerce at the University of California, henceforth UC, sometime around 1907. UC records indicate that he received his Bachelor of Letters in History in 1909 and that he continued to do graduate work in social sciences until 1915. So Kanzaki's trajectory from a Christian college to graduate work in the social sciences at a public land-grant university parallels the trajectories of his own professors at UC, one academic generation prior. Most of the social sciences faculty of UC were part of a so-called new generation of American historians and economists who, as historian Roseanne Currino puts it, combined German historical economics with a religious reformatory zeal. Gonzalo Fonesca observes that this new generation of American historicists came into adulthood in the 1870s and 1880s. Many were sons of Protestant ministers, groomed for careers in the ministry, but set aside the collar of religious mission for the secular gospel of social reform. Key UC faculty members, dating from historian Bernard Moses, PhD at Heidelberg, up to finance economist Carl C. Plin, PhD at Göttingen, received their graduate training in Germany and German historicist methods in particular. So these German historicist methods may give some clue as to why Kanzaki frequently uses the Japanese terms seishin or seishin teki, spirit or spiritual, in a manner that seems strongly indebted to similar uses by the German historical school and their new generation followers in the United States of Geist or spirit mind. The use of spirit has a strongly Hegelian character, where spirit designates a developmental trajectory from material dependence upon nature towards higher forms of mind or social organization. As economist Isaac Lewis wrote in 1918, only a year after Kanzaki's essay, the historical approach to economics is strongly indebted to Hegel's notions of development of spirit. Hegel's doctrine of development has a profound influence on the German founders of historical criticism and scientific socialism, as Malthus's theory of natural selection. Throughout our study of economic history, we take note also of the spiritual forces and governing ideas which determine the relations of individuals, a community, and group, and bind them together. So in Kanzaki's essay, we can see a clear emphasis on development of the spirit or mind, psyche, even understood in Hegelian sense as a set of governing forces or ideas that can combine and that can bind compatriots in America, or Zaibe Doho, into a higher unity. Kanzaki opens his essay by acknowledging positive developments on the material or bushiteki front. In 1916, there were statewide booms in California's agricultural industries, and compatriot farmers were able to build up their investment capital. However, despite the fact that the material base, or bushiteki kiso, of overseas compatriots showed signs of becoming increasingly secure, Kanzaki sounds a note of caution about ongoing deficits in what he sees as the spiritual front, or spiritual progress. Quote, insufficient cooperative spirit and organizational training have meant we have not yet achieved a satisfactory level of progress. These discourses in the subsequent section of the article entitled Progress on the Spiritual Front, or Seishin Teki Homen no Shimpo, are a place where Kanzaki continues to link development of spirit to what he regards as progressive improvement to higher forms of social organization, social self-regulation and order, instituted through marriage and permanent settlement. Here he writes, it is absolutely clear that the spirit of permanent residence or fixed settlement is now pervasive. The tendency to act shamelessly as single men or laborers while traveling abroad has been cast aside. As a result, our customs and manners, our everyday ways of life, and our ways of conducting business have all undergone such complete transformations that we now command a newfound level of respect. So these ideas of forming increasingly higher forms of social organization, of building a sense of permanent settlement that would be tied to a spirit of generational consciousness, take and increase their forms in the crises of 1924 and 1925, when all the efforts of the Japanese Association of America and other attempts to persuade legislators in the United States that Japanese are assimilable populations that are higher in terms of racial hierarchy or desirability fail, and the national origins quotas of the Johnson's-Reed Act of 1924 pass. So under these conditions of material restriction of Japanese immigration into the United States, we see increasing sponsorship by newspapers like the Nichibei Shimbun and Shinsekai of literary contests that explicitly promote the use of Issei and Nisei as terms for emergent generational consciousness. Here's an example from the Shinsekai in 1925, calling for essays and works of literature, plans to reform regional Japanese associations, and alerts or missives from the Dai Nisei to the Dai Issei, etc., prompting a development of generational consciousness or spiritual development through the means of newspaper-sponsored literature. Here are the resulting prize-winning entries from these essays containing messages on what transformations are needed from movement from the Dai Issei to the Dai Nisei, as well as senryu, or topical, satirical, and humorous poems taking Nisei as their keyword concepts. I would say, by means of conclusion here, that we can trace here, based in our community at Center for Japanese Studies at Berkeley, but more broadly, a series of questions of how thinking about humanistic or literary developments of spirit might also tie to other institutional histories of the conceptual statistical study of immigrant populations, and return in 2020 and 2021, 100 years later, to the questions of how we, with our multiform quantitative and qualitative approaches to the question of generation, might approach these in the future.